So I first want to talk about Bob Peck. Bob is somebody who I have an association with through my family because Bob worked for Senator Moynihan in his career. He is a former staffer who has worked on transportation issues for many years and was critically involved in the very important ICE-T legislation, which created really a new paradigm for transportation whereby it was not as focused as it had been previously on highway transportation. Bob is currently managing director of Jones Lang LaSalle. He has been head of the Washington Board of Trade, and he really knows these issues inside and out. So I'd like to introduce Bob Peck.
Thank you, Michael. I have to say that Congressman Blumenauer, as always, sort of laid out the agenda about as well as it can be laid out, and also sort of gave us as much cause for optimism as you can have. He's right. I actually met him when I was running public buildings at GSA, and we had done something not the brightest thing in the world in Portland, which he didn't hesitate to call to our attention. And after I did a few mea culpas and accepted what, in fact, were his really good ideas, we forged a terrific relationship on helping to make federal buildings a little more friendly in their community. Let me go back a little bit in history. I'll talk a little bit about where we were, where I think we are, and where we are going in the short run, and I hope also in the long run with respect to a stimulus package and to a reinvestment in transportation and transportation infrastructure in the United States. And I'll do this quickly. I want to give you more bullets than anything else. But on ICE-T, which came around in 1991, one of the subterranean sort of sub-rosa goals of ICE-T, which Senator Moynihan articulated fairly well, but maybe didn't get picked up so much at the time, was trying to change the attitude in federal transportation funding from building structures, building roads, to moving people and goods efficiently, and that's why it was called Intermodal Surface Transportation Efficiency Act. You know, a mouthful, but a good idea. So there was an idea that we would create more of a sense that transportation is a seamless structure, that it's intermodal, goes between highways and transit and airports and ports and where people live and where they work, and all that needs to be thought of as a single system. And then it was also an attempt, because as Congressman Blumenauer noted, if you follow the money, you find out why things are done a certain way, to try to level the playing field a little bit between the way transit was funded, which, as he noted, came out of general tax dollars, out of a politician's pocket, and put a little bit more on a level playing field, to where highways were funded mostly out of gas tax dollars, which didn't appear to be, didn't run the same risks for politicians, and in fact, highways got a higher proportion of federal funding. But as we also know, but I'm concerned, I have to say, in the current climate, that when you read reports about the stimulus package, and I'm not saying this comes from the president-elect's team or from what's going on in the transition, but the conventional wisdom seems to drive most reporters and broadcasters talking about this to talk about money for roads and bridges, because it's a context that we're used to. And there are, in fact, many forms of the bridge to nowhere. And I think we need to be cautious and careful that we don't fall into a good number of those traps. For example, even though it's been 18 years since ICE-T was passed, some states embrace the idea of intermodalism. Some states have more reason to embrace it. They're more urbanized, quite honestly, than others. And some states don't. But will we fund something else that we've talked about a lot more since ICE-T? Will we fund congestion pricing to make transportation more efficient? Ways in which we can use what transportation structures we have more efficiently, because there are different ways to make transportation clean and efficient. One, which we also hear a lot about and is a great idea, is to turn our car culture from the internal combustion engine more to electricity or gas or other clean fuels. But the other thing that we can do is to try to reduce the need to go to vehicles in the first place, because eventually we'll be talking about how much electricity and how much natural gas we're using in vehicles as well. So will we sort of get that? There were in ICE-T also there was a push to try to make incentives and disincentives so that transportation funding would not just be used to satisfy a wish list, but to create, as I said, an intelligently designed system. I don't want to get into creationism versus evolution, but an intelligently designed system. But so many of the formulas still are based on highway mileage that people do respond to incentives in our system, and I don't think we've quite gotten those right either. And then one thing that I think that I will talk about, and I know Chris will as well, is that the flip side of transportation is land use. Now that's not one of the great issues of our time either when you say it, but the way in which transportation relates to, what that really means is the way transportation relates to the way we live and the way we work. Do the transportation options that we have encourage the Ozzie and Harriet form of development, or do they form a more compact form of development, which in and of itself saves land and gives us the opportunity to do what I said before, which is to make less use of whatever transportation vehicles and structures that we have to build. There was an attempt to do that in Ice-T. It was a bit watered down. It was a new concept. It was a little bit scary to people. It's still a key issue. Can we use smart transportation? Can we create the kinds of structures? Can we incorporate into our thinking about transportation the idea that if people live closer to where they work, and that's not so easy sometimes in a two-earner family because the earners go in different directions, but can we figure out a way to get people closer to where they work? Can we figure out a way that people don't have to hop into a car to go 5 miles to get a gallon of milk? Because as I have always said, if you look in this area, most of you I suspect live in this area, if you think about transportation patterns, some people can walk a couple of blocks and buy a gallon of milk or baby formula if they need it, or, to be honest, grab a beer if you feel like grabbing a beer, and other people have to get into a car. So that if you look at the congestion that we have on our highways, and even in our mass transit, it doesn't necessarily all happen during what's called the peak traffic periods. There are times, I just suggest if you haven't, go to Rockville Pike on a Saturday afternoon and you'll find that there are things that we need to do to buy which create unbelievable traffic messes with people sort of stuck in traffic, spewing lots of fumes. So can we create incentives, and will we spend some of our transportation infrastructure money on creating the sort of smart growth, transit-oriented developments that allow people to walk, to bike, to make use of ride sharing, car renting, the zip car, flex car use that we can see that works more in urbanized areas. And finally, I'll just say this is not an anti-suburban agenda, because what we're seeing in cities and metropolitan areas around the country is a tendency for there to become little urbanized activity centers in our suburbs as well. Finally, and I think these are big issues, and I don't know that we'll solve them today, tomorrow, or anytime soon, is how do we use the leverage of federal funds to make this shift in mentality? And here we come into some very serious issues of federalism, of centralized direction versus devolved decision-making, whether the central government gets to make certain decisions or states and localities. But we have lots of issues, and Michael actually alluded to a number that I just want to put on the table, maybe we can talk about later. And that is, as we spend this money, let's make a couple of distinctions. One, there are certain projects that are shovel-ready, ready to go, but I can tell you from a near lifetime now in dealing in commercial real estate and transportation funding, there are blessed few of them. And many of the ones that are probably not the ones that, in the long run, you'd really go to. If you're talking about fixing certain structures, fine, but a lot of other projects are not really shovel-ready, because if they are long-term big projects and they haven't had funding now, they probably haven't had enough funding to make them shovel-ready today. So that's an issue. Number two, and this is the really big issue and gets us into whether we have central planning in our country or not, is to what extent, if we believe that we have an opportunity now to spend billions and billions of dollars on getting transportation right, to what extent we know that the mindset out there, in some cases, as Congressman Blumenauer said, is ahead, but not necessarily so in the state highway bureaucracies. How do we make sure that the federal money is spent in a way that we think in the long run does lead us to walkable environments, to the use of clean transportation, the opportunity to use less of what we've used to think of as transportation, but more of what we refer to as the ankle express, walking, biking, and those kinds of opportunities. In any event, it's a whole question of whether those things can happen, whether they can work on a rushed schedule, but I submit to you that they're key, and they're things that we really need to think about as this money goes out the door, and we don't have a lot of time to do it because we don't want to be accused of having held up this necessary spending in the name of getting everything perfect. We need to get it right, but not necessarily perfect.